Ötzi the Iceman was supposed to be a man from the mountains, a frozen Copper Age wanderer killed in the Alps more than 5,000 years ago. But when scientists looked inside his DNA, the mystery grew much larger than one murdered man in the ice. Ötzi carried the genetic signature of Europe's first farmers, an ancient population that once spread across the continent before later migrations buried much of their legacy. And strangely, one of the clearest echoes of that lost lineage survives today, not in the Alps, but on the island of Sardinia, where isolation preserved an older European ancestry that most of the mainland slowly lost. That is the mystery. Why does a frozen man from the Alps seem genetically linked to an island hundreds of miles away? And what does that connection reveal about the Europe that existed before Europe became what we know today? Ötzi the Iceman is one of the most famous ancient individuals ever found, not because he was a king, not because he built a monument, and not because his people wrote his story onto clay or parchment. He became famous because the mountains kept him. More than 5,300 years ago, he died high in the Alps, carrying the tools of a Copper Age man, a copper axe, arrows, a backpack frame, clothing stitched from animal skins, and a body marked by tattoos and injury. His corpse, sealed in ice and discovered in 1991, became a rare physical survivor from prehistoric Europe. He was not an abstraction, not just a skull fragment or a scatter of bones. He had skin, clothing, tools, stomach material, wounds, ancestry, and disease risk. He gave science something almost impossible. A man from deep time, preserved so completely that he seemed to stand between archaeology and biography. For years, Ötzi was imagined as a pale alpine wanderer, a rugged mountain European with weathered skin, light colouring, and a face shaped by cold air and high stone passes. That image fit an older expectation about prehistoric Europe. It felt intuitive to many people that an ancient European from the Alps must have looked like the later Northern Europeans in popular imagination. But ancient DNA has been breaking that picture apart for more than a decade. Europe was never one thing. Ice Age foragers, early farmers, steppe herders, Mediterranean islanders, alpine villagers, and later historical peoples all carried different ancestry combinations. Skin tone, eye colour, hair colour, and body form shifted across time. Ötzi sits right inside that transformation, and when his genome was examined in greater detail, the old picture became harder to defend. His ancestry was overwhelmingly tied to Anatolian Neolithic farmers. In the newer genetic analysis, roughly 9/10 of his ancestry fell into that early farmer stream, with only a smaller fraction connected to European hunter-gatherers. That is one reason the Sardinian connection matters. Sardinians, among modern European populations, preserve an unusually strong echo of those same Neolithic farmers. Ötzi was not Sardinian in the simple sense of being from Sardinia. He died in the Alps, and his own community belonged to a Copper Age world of mountain valleys and local networks. But genetically, he stands near the ancestry profile that Sardinia preserved better than the mainland did. The link is not a romantic fantasy. It is a clue. Sardinia became a refuge for a genetic pattern that once existed far more widely, and Ötzi represents that pattern before later migrations transformed much of Europe. This is where the mystery becomes powerful. Ötzi is often treated as a strange, isolated corpse, an alpine accident, a frozen murder victim from a remote past. But genetically, he is also a messenger from a lost Europe. He points back to a time before the steppe migrations changed the continent, before Bronze Age ancestry reshaped populations across Central and Western Europe, before many of the genetic profiles now considered ordinary in Europe had taken their current form. He belonged to a farmer-derived population that had deep roots in the Neolithic expansion. Sardinia kept that signal. Ötzi carried it. The island and the Iceman are tied together because both preserve a world that largely vanished on the mainland. The biggest public controversy, though, is Ötzi's appearance. The newer analysis portrayed Ötzi as having darker pigmentation than earlier reconstruction suggested. Dark eyes, dark hair, darker than the pale alpine image that dominated older illustrations. This created confusion because of the so-called reconstruction released with the study. In everyday language, many people hear it and imagine very dark pigmentation. In ancient DNA discussions, the phrase really means darker than modern Northern Europeans, darker than old reconstructions, or darker than the baseline assumed for ancient alpine populations. Those are not the same claim. Ötzi was best understood as a man with pigmentation in the Mediterranean or Near Eastern farmer range, probably olive, brown, or heavily sun-browned in life, rather than the pale, northern-looking figure once portrayed. That distinction matters because Ötzi also carried major light-skin alleles in genes important in European pigmentation. The older simple story would say, light alleles equal light skin. The newer polygenic picture is more complex. Pigmentation is shaped by many genetic variants, by ancestry, and by environment. Ötzi had major alleles linked with lighter pigmentation, but his broader genetic profile still pointed toward a darker complexion than many modern Europeans. He had brown eyes and dark hair. His farmer ancestry connected him to populations from sunnier regions. His alpine life exposed him to intense mountain light, reflected snow, and hard outdoor labor. The result was not a Scandinavian-looking Iceman. It was a Copper Age farmer-descended mountain man whose appearance fit better with southern European or Mediterranean tones than with the pale stereotype of prehistoric Europe. This is where Sardinia again becomes the key comparison. Modern Sardinians are not identical to Ötzi, but they give a living reference point for the kind of ancient farmer ancestry he carried. Sardinians often cluster genetically near early European farmers, and they show why dark must be handled with precision. Sardinians are Europeans. Many have olive or medium Mediterranean pigmentation. They are not outside Europe. They preserve a very old European layer. When Ötzi is described as darker than expected, the most grounded way to imagine him is not as an outsider dropped into the Alps from some unrelated world, but as a representative of an older European farmer population whose strongest modern echo survives in Sardinia. That changes the emotional force of the story. The mystery is not that Ötzi was alien to Europe. The mystery is that our picture of ancient Europe was too narrow. Europe's first farmers were not simply the ancestors of one modern nation or one modern identity. They were a vast ancestral layer that spread across the continent, built the first farming societies, and then survived unevenly. Mainland Europe changed repeatedly. Sardinia preserved more of the older pattern. Ötzi, frozen in the Alps, gives that older pattern a face, a body, a toolkit, and a death scene. Yet the strangest part of the story is that this legacy, once dominant across huge stretches of Europe, was later buried beneath other migrations, other peoples, and other histories. Across much of the mainland, their genetic signal was diluted by later Bronze Age pastoralists from the Eurasian steppe. But in one rugged island in the western Mediterranean, that older signal survived with unusual strength. That island is Sardinia, and through Sardinia, the vanished world of Europe's first farmers still reaches into the modern age. Sardinia sits apart from Europe, surrounded by blue water, mountains, limestone ridges, hidden valleys, and villages that long turned inward rather than outward. It was never untouched by history. Phoenicians came, Carthaginians came, Romans came, medieval kingdoms rose and fell, traders moved along the coast, empires left language, law, and stone behind. Yet the island's interior held something far older. In the highlands, where shepherds moved with goats and sheep through difficult terrain, ancient genetic patterns persisted with unusual force. The story of Sardinia is not the story of a frozen island, locked outside time. It is the story of partial shelter, of geography slowing the great human tides that overwhelmed other places, and of a population that kept a stronger link to the farmers who first changed Europe than almost any other people alive in Europe today. That is why Sardinians matter so much to ancient DNA. When researchers began comparing prehistoric skeletons to modern populations, Sardinia kept appearing like a ghost from the Neolithic world. The islanders were not exact copies of the first farmers because such purity never existed in human history, but their ancestry pointed strongly toward the same early agricultural populations that spread from Anatolia into Europe thousands of years ago. These were the people who built villages, cleared woodland, raised animals, buried their dead in new ritual traditions, and carried a way of life that multiplied human settlement across the continent. Their genetic legacy was once a main pillar of European ancestry. Then the Bronze Age changed the mainland. Steppe ancestry entered much of Europe with dramatic force. In many regions, the older farmer signal became only one layer in a more complex mixture. But Sardinia held on to that earlier layer with remarkable strength. His death itself adds a human edge to the genetic story. Ötzi was not a specimen walking calmly into history. He was a wounded man in a mountain landscape struck by an arrow, carrying gear that suggests movement through dangerous terrain. He had eaten shortly before death. He had physical stress, injury, and tattoos that have been linked to painful joints or therapeutic marking. He was not a symbol to himself. He was a man trying to survive, perhaps fleeing, perhaps returning, perhaps caught in conflict. Yet inside him was a genetic archive of the Neolithic world. He could not know that thousands of years later, scientists would compare his DNA to islanders far to the southwest, or that his paternal line would help reveal how Europe's first farmers survived in fragments. His paternal line makes the connection even sharper. Ötzi carried Y chromosome haplogroup G2A, specifically a branch connected with early farmers. This paternal lineage was common among many Neolithic farming groups in Europe, then became much rarer after later population shifts. It is still found in Sardinia at elevated levels compared with much of Europe, which gives the island an unusual genetic relationship to the male lines of the Neolithic farmers. In simple terms, Ötzi's father's father's father belonged to a lineage that was once part of the farming expansion into Europe and then declined across much of the mainland. Sardinia became one of the places where that ancient male signal persisted more clearly. This is not just a technical detail, it is a survival trail. The same lineage that tied Ötzi to a Neolithic agricultural past also points towards Sardinia as a shelter for that past. His maternal line tells an even stranger story. Ötzi's mitochondrial lineage is extremely rare today, almost like a vanished thread from the maternal side of Neolithic Europe. That means his mother's deep maternal ancestry belonged to a line that did not persist widely into modern populations. His paternal line survived in scattered pockets, especially places such as Sardinia and nearby Mediterranean regions, but his maternal line became almost ghost-like. Together, these two markers create a haunting genetic portrait. Ötzi was not simply a man with a famous frozen corpse. He was carrying lineages from a world already vulnerable to disappearance. His father's line survived in scattered form. His mother's line nearly vanished from the modern map. He was, in a very real sense, standing at the edge of a demographic cliff that he never knew existed. Sardinia's own ancient landscape deepens that connection. The island is famous for its nuraghi, massive stone towers from the Bronze Age, built by a society that developed with strong local character. These towers are not from Ötzi's lifetime, but they speak to the same larger theme. Sardinia did not simply mirror the mainland. It formed its own path. Its rugged geography, island setting, and inward highlands created a setting where older ancestry could persist through later upheavals. While the mainland saw stronger step impact and later mixtures, Sardinia remained one of Europe's great genetic time capsules. The towers came later, but the ancestry beneath them reached deeper, back toward the Neolithic farmers who had spread agriculture across Europe. The real-world implication is enormous. Sardinia helps researchers reconstruct what Europe looked like before the Bronze Age transformations. It gives a rare baseline for early farmer ancestry. Ötzi gives an individual case from that older world. A Copper Age man whose ancestry was overwhelmingly farmer-derived, whose paternal line belongs to the Neolithic expansion, and whose appearance challenges the pale Alpine stereotype. Together, Sardinia and Ötzi show that ancient Europe was layered, shifting, and regionally diverse. They also show how easily later populations can be mistaken for the timeless original form of a continent. What people think of as ancient European is often really a later mixture projected backward. There is also a deeper irony. Sardinia is sometimes treated as peripheral, an island at the edge of the main story. But in genetic history, the edge can preserve what the center loses. The mainland was crossed by migrations, cultural turnovers, expansions, collapses, and empire. The island absorbed influences, but its geography softened the force of replacement. That means the apparent periphery became a vault. Sardinia kept what much of Europe forgot. Ötzi, discovered in a glacier far from Sardinia, helps unlock that vault because his genome resembles the older farmer pattern that the island preserved. This is why the Sardinian link is more than a footnote. It is a correction. Ötzi's connection to Sardinians tells us that the people who brought farming to Europe did not simply vanish. Their legacy was transformed, diluted, pushed into pockets, and preserved in islands and mountain zones. Their genes persist in many Europeans, but Sardinia carries the signal with unusual clarity. Ötzi shows that this ancestry was once present in Alpine Europe as well. The island is not an isolated oddity. It is a survivor of a broader prehistoric Europe. The pigmentation debate then becomes part of a larger misunderstanding. The point is not to force Ötzi into a modern category. The point is that ancient Europeans had appearances shaped by ancestry combinations different from many later Europeans. He had farmer ancestry connected to Anatolia. He had dark eyes and dark hair. His skin was darker than the old pale reconstructions. He carried some major light-skin alleles while still fitting a broader profile that was not pale Northern European. That mixture is exactly what makes him important. He proves that skin color in prehistoric Europe cannot be reduced to one simple image. Ancient DNA has broken the old artistic habit of painting every ancient European as if he came from a modern northern village. And still, the story resists a simple ending. Ötzi was not the first farmer. Sardinians are not unchanged Neolithic people. The early farmers themselves were not a single pure population. The steppe migrations did not erase everything before them. Human history never moves with clean lines. It moves through fragments, survival, loss, and unexpected continuity. The same man who died violently in the Alps carried a paternal lineage now especially visible in Mediterranean pockets. The same island that later built Nuragi preserved an ancestry older than those towers. The same terminology that caused public confusion points to a deeper truth. The ancient European past was more complex than the categories people try to impose on it. So when we look at Sardinia, we are not just looking at an island. We are looking at one of the last bright windows into the farmer world that transformed Europe before the Bronze Age. When we look at Ötzi, we are not just looking at a frozen corpse. We are looking at a man whose body bridged the Alps, Anatolia, Sardinia, and the lost genetic landscape of Neolithic Europe. His axe, his tattoos, his wounds, his ancestry, and his dark alpine face all point in the same direction. Europe was never a single colour, a single people, or a single origin story. It was a continent of layers, and some of its oldest layers still survive, where the water, mountains, and time protected them. Thank you for watching. If this story of Sardinia, Ötzi, and the hidden ancestry of Europe's first farmers pulled you deeper into the ancient past, then stay with the channel, because every new genome, every forgotten skeleton, and every island population is changing the way we understand human origins. The Iceman still has more to tell us. Sardinia still holds part of the vanished map, and somewhere between the frozen Alps and the stone towers of the Mediterranean, the lost farmers of Europe are still speaking through the people who carry their blood.